Welcome to our show today. It's a real treat. It's a strange treat, I must admit. Ordinarily, for what we're doing now, Hayden and I would be together in a field at Hengistbury Head, doing an experiment for all of you to see in flesh. But in this new lockdown, remote age, where we're having a go at sharing it with you digitally. So we thought we'd have a go. Hayden's been doing this on and off for the last few weeks in various forms. And I think it can be quite a good show. We've had some fun with it, but it's all really part of a bigger project between Bournemouth University and Hengistbury Head, where we have a HLF funded project where we're doing experimental archaeology as part of public outreach, but also as part of research. So Hayden's doing a PhD looking at the metallurgy of Hengistbury Head and using experimental archaeology to help understand the material found at Hengistbury and some of the things that would have happened on the head, and alongside that share some experiences of it with the public as we are today. So the aim really of the project is to use experiment to understand archaeology while also sharing the magic and the actual fleshed out human side of archaeology, rather than thinking of metallurgy as a crusty old bit of slag in a ditch at Hengistbury Head or a small clay hearth in a field. It's an embodied process. It's a process that human beings would have done. Human beings not unlike Hayden, possibly in bigger groups than he is today. So that's why we're doing it, really. It's about engaging with the technology of the past, experiencing things that may have been experienced, but also giving us analogues for what we see in the archaeological record. And you can probably see around Hayden there's various patches of ash, there's bits of burnt material, there's a skull, a symbolic offering, some ceramic vessels, lots of different bits of archaeological remains that we'd see in the archaeological record, and we can use experiment to help understand what role they may have played in the process and how people would have engaged with those spaces and areas. So it's a really powerful tool, and a lot of the stuff that you can see Hayden doing, the bellowing, and as we go forward in a minute, the casting itself, it all happens within a material space which we can see archaeologically, but it's the blanks between it. So doing it experimentally, we get to fill in those blanks a little bit, and that's why we love doing it. So the first step of the process, which we've been doing now, I say we, I shouldn't say we, Hayden's been doing all the hard work. The first step in the process really is building the hearth itself. Can you adjust it so we can see Hayden properly on speaker view, please? That's something you need to do at your end, I think. There should be a button to turn on speaker view rather than grid view. I don't think we can do that on our end. There should be at the top right a little waffle-like button on your Zoom that should allow that.
The gallery and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. It looks like
three dots.
Or a 9-dotted waffle at the top right of the screen. You can switch between gallery view and speaker view, any luck. So as I was saying, the first thing that Hayden would have done in this process is build the hearth itself. In this case, we're using a bowl hearth, which is an archaeological feature that we see on sites. It's a small clay-lined pit. We tend to only find the truncated element of it, so the bottom bit, often it gets lost in plowing. So we have to infer what type of superstructure it has. In this case, we're going very minimal. We're using a fairly lo-fi example. Thanks, Cal, for your help there. We're basing it on almost the minimum building we can get away with the archaeological evidence that we have. And that's something Hayden and I have been reaching collectively now for probably 3 years, Hayden, 4 years? When did you finish your undergrad?
Don't tell me. Yeah, about 4 years, could be 5 soon.
One of the really unique characteristics, particularly of early metallurgy in Britain, is it's near invisible in some places. We know from proxy evidence that it happens, but in areas like the Great Orme in Wales, where we know there's mining, we know there's exploitation of minerals, the actual features for smelting are incredibly ephemeral and very hard to find. So Hayden and I have been exploring ways of doing metallurgy, leaving as minimal a recognizable impact as possible, and then using the areas that we've been using experimentally to understand that space, but also understand what techniques we could use to find this process. So it's a really valuable tool for that. So the hearth itself is just a small clay pit. There's a toyer, which is a clay tube that connects the bellows to the furnace. Now, the furnace we'd expect in this instance to get up to around 1300 degrees or thereabouts, which for many materials, in terms of the bellows themselves, would melt or burn at that temperature. So we make a small clay tube that is basically the interface between the two, and the bellows are resting in that. And that serves two functions. It allows us to get air into the hearth, as Hayden's doing quite well now. He's demonstrating perfectly. But it also stops some of that suck back. So when Hayden's pulling backwards, it's not pulling hot air out of the fire as it would if you had a solid plug. The reason we use bellows and the reasons we use charcoal is because A, it allows us to get a nice high temperature, but it also allows us to get an atmosphere that facilitates a good cast in this instance. If you use wood, for example, you could potentially get quite high temperatures by forcing air in, but it also has a very oxidizing atmosphere, which causes the metal we're trying to melt to actually oxidize and almost, for an analogy, turn to rust on the surface. And we want to be able to cast a nice, clean, pure metal. So doing it with charcoal allows us to build a reducing atmosphere that makes it a much easier, a much better cast. So Hayden's built the furnace, he's popped in a toyer, he's got bellows on it, he's lit it, he's filled it with charcoal, and he's been burning and burning and burning to get it nice and hot and up to temperature. Now, what you won't have seen, because we had to do this early on, is Hayden charged a crucible. So a crucible is a ceramic vessel that we use to melt the metal. Here's one we made earlier. Blue Peter badge is on its way. Based on a prehistoric example, a fairly open vessel. And what we do is blast hot air into that vessel from above. You'll see it's a fairly open vessel. And the reason we do that is when you blast hot air at a ceramic, they're functioning right on the edge of their tolerances, their ability to survive. And actually you can melt crucibles quite comfortably in a furnace like this. So we blow down on top of it to make sure that the heat goes on the metal and melts the metal rather than melting the crucible. We've had a question, Hayden, asking about the bellows used. It's a really interesting question. There is some elements. We know from the fact we get toyers, so the little blowpipe, that forced air is being used. We see in early pictographs, early hieroglyphs in Egypt, for example, some cultures early on use blowpipes. I must admit, it is very, very hard. Having tried it repeatedly with a blowpipe, it's very hard to maintain consciousness for long enough to do it. But it is possible. In terms of bellows, archaeologically, what we tend to see are depressions around the hearth. So you can see where Hayden is there. If he was to repeat this time and time and time again, he would essentially work a hole into the ground. And in the earliest cases of Bronze Age metallurgy in the Near East and in later metallurgy, we see structures in and around the hearth that suggest bellows are there. But of course, they are organic things. These particularly are just made from leather, very basic bellows. Actually, worth pointing out that bag bellows, as Hayden's using, are some of the most efficient bellows you can use. I don't know about Hayden, but I tried to build some medieval concertina bellows, and to get the same efficiency, you have to go quite big and quite technical. Whereas if you see the two bags Hayden's got there, they catch litres of air with every pump, and that is a huge volume of air forced in fairly rapidly. If you're interested in bellows, interestingly, somewhere that's worth having a quick peek at is the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. They have an incredible collection of ethnographic examples and anthropological examples of bellows. One particular favourite of mine is a tree trunk, a hollowed out tree trunk used like a bicycle.
Fantastic. fantastic. No, I've thought about that.
I'd love to one day build one. Maybe I'll, if we stay in lockdown, Hayden, that's your challenge for Archaeology Week next year.
Okay, wicked. Yeah, on it.
So we do have evidence, but much of it, I admit, is proxy evidence, and it's something that we've kind of learned and developed through experimental archaeology, like Hayden's doing now. So where was I? I've forgotten now. So within the furnace, we've got the crucible, an open crucible, as I was saying.
A mixture of copper and tin as well, isn't it?
Copper and tin, that's right. So we're doing the alloying as we go today, aren't we, Hayden?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. We ran out of bronze, and I was like, oh God, got to get set up. Oh my God. And we haven't got any bronze ready. So actually we're trying to alloy the two metals together to make bronze, which is copper and then a little bit of tin. The reason why that's a bit more of a problem is ideally we've got to get the copper to melt around about 1,150 degrees. That's really hot. And the ceramic, which holds it, the crucible, starts to dissolve around about 1,000 degrees. So we have to very rapidly, but in a controlled manner, heat it up, melt the copper, which then mixes with the tin. And the tin melts at a much lower temperature. But once you've made that alloy, those two metals mixed together, the alloy actually melts at a much lower temperature. So it's been a tense hour prior to this getting the first temperature, and we don't know what's going to be inside that crucible when we pull it out. It could be it may not have mixed, it may not have melted properly, or we could have melted the crucible fabric and it could just be a big lump of molten silica. So that's exciting.
What you're saying, Hayden, is you've given yourself a particularly hard challenge today.
Yeah, I have. Yeah. Inadvertently.
And then do the cast. The thing it's very hard to see, but what's happening in that furnace is an incredibly volatile reaction at the moment. The lining of the crucible's made of clay, so it's an aluminium silicate. The metal in there, the copper, the tin, it's all reacting with each other. So the surface of the crucible will be melting with the flux of the ash, the alkali of the ash from the charcoal will be facilitating a glass even forming on that crucible, and that will be reacting with the metal that's melting, and it's a very, very unpredictable process. And even in modern foundries, there's a 1 in 3 failure rate with castings, which is incredibly high. And I also say now, as a disclaimer for Hayden ahead of the eventual cast, I'm sure it'll be fine. So in terms of how long we've been going, Hayden started this about an hour before the Zoom. Is that right, Hayden?
Yeah, about 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.
So you can, on a good day, you can get a furnace like this up to temperature in about 20 minutes to half an hour, chuck in a crucible, melt for maybe 15 to 20 minutes if you're feeling particularly strong and bellowy. You'll see at the moment Hayden's fueling up as he goes. So at the moment, the furnace is losing an incredible amount of heat. No pressure, Hayden.
I know, yeah.
But when you've got multiple people, you can carry on bellowing as you fuel up, and you can actually get the temperatures in really efficiently and really rapidly. It'll be a little bit longer today because we want to make sure that when Hayden reaches in to get that crucible out, that it's properly melted. It's going to hold its melt for long enough to get that cast. What we'll be anticipating at that stage, you can see down the bottom there a piece of wood with some clay in it, and that is our mould. And Hayden's been experimenting the last few weeks looking again at how we can do metallurgy leaving very little trace. And something we've realized, I say we again, the royal way, something Hayden's realized is you can carve something into wood and line it with a very, very thin layer of clay, and it works as a pretty decent crucible. And that leaves very little evidence in terms of what would survive archaeologically. But crucially, the wood can be used and reused again. So with a simple lining of clay, you can reproduce artifacts. So it's a really novel way of experimenting, and it's not something I've seen done archaeologically or spoken about much. So it's one of those things where a little bit of blue sky thinking during an experiment is quite a good thing.
Yeah.
You explore possibilities you wouldn't necessarily have thought of before. And in a lot of technological reconstructions, the folks doing the reconstructions have worked in the industry. So Ronald Tilecote, the kind of founder of archaeometallurgy, came from a metallurgical background. So a lot of the inferences he drew and a lot of the interpretations he had for the archaeological record were drawn from his experience in modern metallurgy. So taking that background knowledge away and just saying, what if I try this? What if we do this? It can...
Chucking a human in with a fire and just seeing what they do, you know,
yeah.
with all the materials and a very rough roadmap of, keyword, a rough idea of where they want to go with it, but just seeing what organic kind of processes evolve out of that is very interesting.
It's one of the things I think that's always drawn me to experiment is the unforeseen things, the accidents, the mishaps, the things that give you a bit of a learning curve that you didn't quite see coming. Something from some of my own experiments early on was down to the efficiency of bellows. For a long time I was using bag bellows, much like Hayden's, nowhere near as well crafted, I should point out, but using just very simple bag bellows. And I switched for some of my experiments to using a mechanical pump. I was looking at copper smelting, so that's turning an ore mineral into a metal, and I couldn't understand why I was struggling to smelt with this mechanical pump, whereas with a bag bellow it was easy. I was getting the perfect atmosphere. And what I discovered, or what I inferred from the process, was actually it's that little gap, that moment of pause between the bellowing that allows carbon monoxide to form, allows the atmosphere to combust and then burn, but inefficiently enough that it gives you the desirable atmosphere, that really helps facilitate the process. And in not having that pumping action and mechanism, it denied the furnace the atmosphere it needed. So actually using something more lo-fi and low-tech helped understand the process a little bit more. Last summer when we were making pots with Hayden, he was firing them. Did they survive? That's a good question.
When was this?
Was that, you might have to give us a bit more details. Was that on place during the field school?
Was it here? We've got a pottery kiln here in the woods. All these crucibles are fired from that. But I did that by myself, so I'm not sure.
If it was stuff you did with us during place, almost certainly not. We had an awful lot of explosions. One or two things did survive, and I left all the experimental material in the corner of the field to basically see what happens to it after a few years. So I'm going to go back in there, pull back all the grass and vegetation, see what remains. So if your pot did survive and you didn't collect it, it'll still be there, being part of a future experimental archaeological record. When you said you could use a wooden crucible, what lined with clay, do you mean a mould? I do. Sorry, that was a slip of the tongue. Yes, wooden mould, as you can see in the bottom of the screen. A wooden crucible would be an absolute disaster.
Hilarious. It'd be pretty spectacular. I mean, from doing the experiments where I've actually just cast straight into wood, it's crazy. I mean, like, you've got 1,000-degree metal, you've got wood, it's fire everywhere, there's gas going all over the place. It's a pretty full-on experience. Yeah.
It is. It's one of the most engrossing things you can do, actually, when you're casting, as Hayden is doing today. And I'm not going to suggest we'll do this because it's probably highly questionable from a audience participation perspective, is to take a very freshly casted piece of metal and expose it to other things. So as Hayden said there, if you take a freshly casted bit of bronze or even a crucible, actually you can see some of it on the wood there, and place it on something organic. The rate at which it catches fire just gives a real hint at the temperatures involved. And something we often do, or I've done with students in the past, is to pop a freshly cast bit of bronze into a metal bucket full of water and watch the smoke storm eruption emerge. And it is an incredibly interesting way seeing and understanding that high temperature. But it's also something I suspect we do see some evidence for in the past. There are some bronze artifacts from places like Fiskerton and Flag Fen. These are fenland watery places where we find a lot of votive offerings in the water. So bronze metal objects that have been chucked in potentially as gifts to one god or another. Some of those show evidence that they've gone into the water hot. And that's quite interesting. So it suggests that there's a ritual metallurgist there somewhere producing these things to chuck in as offerings, to be part of this smoky, steamy performance. And I can't help but notice there's a pond behind Hayden. It would be quite fun. I'm not suggesting we do that today, but one day to recreate something like that. And that association with production casting and ritual is something we see elsewhere in things like founders' hoards. We see things that have been cast from alloys that never would have been functioning, never would have been used, very high leady alloys, almost practice pieces. And we see the most of them in hoards, in deposits in the ground that people have intentionally put there, either to come back to and get at a later point, or indeed as offerings. So it's interesting to see that prehistoric relationship between what Hayden's doing now, this performance of metallurgy, performing the past, and ritual and engaging with kind of the otherworldly aspects of past society. So there's a lot to metallurgy, I think, beyond the function of it.
Absolutely. No, I just wanted to just to make another point, because you're talking about organic mistakes that happen, and actually when you're pursuing a craft like this, you learn as you go, unless you've got previous sort of experience in it. And we've been trying to cast a number of different hammerheads, and they've all gone wrong so far. But last week it went spectacularly wrong, where actually I just slipped and spilt the entire crucible full of bronze all over the floor. But it was a very interesting, I analysed what I did wrong afterwards and thought, well, what actually happened? Because that's how you refine your designs of your crucibles or your moulds and make the process more efficient and actually make it work. But all it was is I put the glove on the wrong hand. I was thinking about how I was going to get to the furnace, pull out all the charcoal with the scraper, and in the other hand, without a glove, use the tongs to pull out and manipulate the crucible. Actually, I put the glove on the wrong hand, and by the time I got around to the other side of the furnace, I was committed, and I had the glove on the tong hand, and I couldn't handle the tongs correctly, and I just spilt the entire crucible everywhere. But it was a very human error. You know, it's a very silly thing. You know, you would have thought that you'd think about it more, but actually, no, it just happened. But the spills and the shapes of the waste that I produced there were very interesting. Actually, you see not a huge amount, but you do see evidence of spills, drips, where practitioners have just messed up, and actually all the material's been spilt out of the crucible or out of the furnace. It's again, that's that sort of a very human aspect of this process, making mistakes.
It's yeah, thinking when you told me that story earlier today, it just reminded me of it's a choreographed performance, particularly that moment of casting where if one thing goes awry, you can lose the whole hour, you can lose the whole cast, the whole smelt, and there's that skill, that practice of doing it is a huge part of the process, and something we tend not to see or consider too much archaeologically. So it's nice to have the opportunity to think about that aspect of it. Yeah,
and you have so little time, as Derek said, one thing goes wrong and the entire process can just start to fail. But I'll spend about 2 hours, or no, an hour and a half getting this to temperature, but actually I've got seconds to pull the crucible out and fully pour it all before the metal rapidly cools down and solidifies. So it's a very tense few seconds. A lot can go wrong. And that's usually where we actually see our evidence in terms of production process where things go wrong. Failed moulds to half full of metal, crucibles with metal still in them, broken stuff. It's what people throw away actually that we tend to see, not the bits they succeed at, or we do in the artifacts that they usually don't see.
So how are we doing there in terms of timing, Hayden? How's it feeling?
I think we're probably getting there. You know, we've been going for a while now. It's been kept at, as what I reckon, around about sort of 900 degrees, a bit higher. So what I will do is I will push temperature up by a couple more 100 degrees, hopefully, and then we'll try and cast it. But there's a slight caveat to how one can do that, because you can't just force loads of air into the furnace, because although it will raise temperature really high, which is what we do want, you'll actually start changing the chemical atmosphere Derek mentioned earlier inside the furnace. You'll push so much oxygen inside the furnace that will start to rust off that metal. And actually what you'll get instead of metal when you pull out the crucible is a big lump of slag, because the burnt metal, the oxides, actually react with the silica in the crucible and form this intermediary waste product that we don't want. There's no use to us, but it's a controlled heat. So I'm going to try and heat it, try and raise the temperature, but not too fast.
So Sally, really to answer your question, what we've put in the crucible, it's both bronze and tin. So we put in the pure form. Sorry, copper and tin. Oh, I'm having a terrible day of slip-ups today. Copper and tin. By weight, around is what, 90% copper, 10% tin, Hayden?
Yeah. Classic 10% tin bronze.
So we're hoping it will alloy within the melt itself, which is why we've been hammering it a little bit longer than we perhaps normally would. What will happen next, just to give you a heads up before the moment of truth, which will be a very fleeting moment, I suspect, Hayden will need to reach into the furnace, scrape away as much charcoal as he can, as quickly as he can without losing too much heat. Then this is where it gets hard to do with one person. Pick up the crucible, scrape any excess charcoal off the top of that crucible, and then pour it into the mould within the space of about less than a minute, I would imagine. It's the hardest thing I'd say to do on your own of the whole process, because what we would normally do is one of us would pick up the crucible with tongs, nice two-handed and secure. The other one would scrape away the excess charcoal and then pour into the mould, And that, I think that highlights a little bit of something about these kind of processes. They're not something one person tends to do alone of a Saturday afternoon. They're quite a communal process where lots of people would have to dedicate serious time to doing this. And when we think about the extent of metal, the volume of metal we see in the archaeological record, this is a full-time specialism for groups of people beyond one or two individuals, from mining an ore to processing that ore to smelting the metal itself to making the metal and then to forming that metal into a finished object. It's a huge process. It requires specialisms on the metallurgical front, but also looking at what you can see in front of you, carpenters, woodworkers, leather workers, tanners, clay processing, clay production, potting, charcoal making. Is huge community endeavor, and that's one of the reasons when we talk about metallurgy and archaeology, it tends to be seen alongside increasing complexity, societies becoming more hierarchical, becoming more structured in that sense, to allow full-time specialists. You can't eat bronze, so Hayden can't have a nice cup of tea and sit down and munch on his spearhead at the end of this cast. So someone needs to be providing food to allow this to happen. So it's something that has the potential to develop within a society that is producing more excesses, producing more abundance of material. And quite often when you see metallurgy appear in an archaeological record somewhere in the world, it's taken as a sign of complexity. It's taken as a sign that society has changed to that type of organisation. What's interesting is we do see examples. Central Eurasia is one where it seems to be more piecemeal and seems to be more akin to seasonal gathering and seasonal production and part of a much more organic life way. So while in a lot of examples, and some of the most famous examples of the Near East and Europe, we see it coming along with complexity and more specialisms, in other parts of the world, we see it more organically developed. I can see now Hayden's getting quite aggressively bellowing, so it must be getting quite close to the moment of truth.
Yeah, I think we are. I'm just shifting nervously because I don't know what's going to happen, but that's the beauty of it.
So the things Hayden will be looking out for now is stuff like the colour of the flame, the feel of the temperature. Actually, when you're at this stage of a cast, it's hard to describe the type of heat that you feel coming off of a furnace. It's somewhere between opening a log burner and burning your eyebrows off. It's a very unique feeling, and as you take a furnace up to temperature, you feel it get hotter and hotter and hotter. The colour will get whiter and whiter to the point where Hayden's looking in at the crucible there, it will start to really hurt your eyes to look for too long. And quite often at this stage I'll have sunglasses on. It's quite nice to do it actually in a darker environment. We see in the Iron Age, for example, when we have evidence for metallurgy indoors, it's in roundhouses where the door faces away from the sun, so a darker darker atmosphere. And it's quite nice doing it in the dark because you can see all the bits that you could potentially step on and burn yourself. But also you can see the very subtle colour changes, as Hayden's looking out for now, when it's going to be ready, which is looking very soon from a distant perspective.
Yeah, I think we're going to go for it. Okay, you ready?
Okay, so I'm going to shut up now and let Hayden do his thing, but we'll carry on talking afterwards so you can enjoy it in full HD.
Right. Oh yeah, brilliant. Oh God.
Have an applause of one for that, Hayden. That is one of the best casts I've ever seen you do.
That nerve-wracking, absolutely nerve-wracking. Brilliant.
So,
oh God.
As Hayden was doing that, you could see just about him scraping the charcoal off the top. And actually, I'm not sure I've ever got such a clean cast as that. That was quite an impressive show. I can see you getting some rounds of applause digitally from Cal. Thanks, Cal.
Yeah.
What will be happening now is that will be cooling very slowly in the mould, so it will take a few minutes before it's able to be chipped out. But we will keep filming and keep going until we can take that out. Is that right, Hayden?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you want to see because as you pour it into an open cast mould, so lots of oxygen can get to the top of the metal. Because it's really hot, it's still molten when you pour it in. The top of the metal goes black, as you can see, and that's the metal oxidizing and forming this form of copper oxide. But on the underside, where there's no oxygen getting to it, you'll get this lovely gold and bronze color. So I want to show you all that. Actually, you can't quite see it, but I'll see if I can move the camera, get a view of it. I'm not very, but around the edge where the clay lining meets the metal, you can see the heat fluctuating between where the wood's burning here. It's actually stopping the metal from oxidizing, so you kind of get the shift of color on the metal. But it is still extremely hot, and that's what you got to remember, that actually not things that aren't just glowing red. That crucible there is still probably way over 400 degrees. So lots of respect for the metal.
Hey Hayden, could you, while using tongs obviously, just move the crucible to one side to show just how hot that is?
Yeah.
So you can see just how much heat remains in that crucible fabric, even though it's out of the furnace now.
Yeah, I think we timed that quite well, because you can really heat the crucible up even higher, and the whole thing just bursts into flames. But it's quite a thin crucible; it's quite a delicate one, and we don't want to abuse it too much, because it could just fail, and we'd have lost all that metal in the bottom of the furnace. But if I could give more HD to the camera, and maybe I can take you off the loop and just bring you a bit closer, but you can see all these little globules of metal that spilled, and they've formed these lovely copper prills, bronze prills, pardon me. Now, although junior metal, and these are the sort of things that you do find around metalworking areas. So it's just lovely to produce our own versions and just see how far they go, what shapes they make. Helps us really try and understand the process. How shaky this all is, but I'll try and see. If you look on the underside, it's a completely different color. Oh, the outside. Okay, right. I'm gonna just pop it back up here so I can use my hands, and I'll probably just pull that spearhead out. This camera stand's got its own rain mat that I made hurriedly before the meeting demonstration, just because I had no idea what the weather was going to do. So I'm just going to attach that and drop you down a bit. Oh, I need a drink of water in a sec. Okay. All right then, let's see what we've made. And actually, you know, even the clay lining of the mold isn't even that badly damaged, you know. Oh yeah,
look at that. Oh, you can see the oxidization live and in HD there. That was wonderful.
Beautiful. Now it's quite a chunky, you know, you can try a chunky spear, but we'd render that down probably by a little bit of cold working around the edges to harden it, but then mainly by files. But there you go. Alloyed bronze cast spearhead. And just look at how that mold is just clay, but it's still, you know, nothing there. And if you take out the clay mold, the wood isn't even that altered at all. That's a little bit burnt, but
so in theory, you could use that again, Hayden?
Yeah, this is actually the second time this mold's been used.
Hey,
so, you know, and that is all you're actually making. Material.
What I'd be quite interested in doing, and I'm just going to hit Hayden with this blind, is
hit me.
Thinking about alloying and directly into casting. It would be lovely to do some analysis on that blade and see if the tin is distributed evenly along it, in terms of how well it's alloyed. Because quite often you think about alloying being a step unto itself, and then being remelted and reused, which would help diffuse the metal more fully. But I'd be intrigued to see just how well alloyed that spearhead is based on an hour's worth of alloying. That's quite exciting.
Yeah, because you know the tin sits at the bottom because it melts first, and the copper's above that, and it slowly melts into it. But you're basically relying on diffusion. You know, you're relying on enough time and energy available to those two metals so they equally disperse themselves. And if we had the time to show you, we'd polish this up, and you can roughly tell, you know, very broadly what composition something has in terms of how much tin there is in the bronze, by what sort of color it has. You know, if we had a lot more bronze tin towards, say, this section of the spearhead, it would come up with a much more silver color. Whereas if it was more of a more equally mixed tin bronze over here, about 10% tin to 90% copper, you'd have a more of a golden color. But it would be very cool to zap it. And I don't think usually I would prepare the metal prior to this in a session just like this, but just making an ingot or a billet of bronze metal. But I thought we'd go for something a bit tricky today.
In answer to the question we've just had, yeah, we will tweet loads of photos. We'll pop them on Hayden's Instagram, and I'll tweet them today via Twitter. Hayden, are you on Twitter?
I'm not on Twitter. No, I don't tweet.
So
not yet, anyway.
Keep an eye on the Bournemouth University or Archaeology and Anthropology at Bournemouth, my Twitter, and indeed the Hengistbury Head Twitter, and we'll stick as many pictures as we can on Twitter over the next few hours.
Brilliant.
All right, so shall we wrap it up there, Hayden? What do you think?
I think, unless anyone's got any more questions, but I'll just say thank you very much for joining us. This has been a lovely Wednesday afternoon for me. I hope it's been a lovely Wednesday afternoon for you. Cool stuff is still happening. The world isn't ended, and we will get back to doing this in person. And hopefully some of you can come and actually get involved with this, which would be fantastic.
That's right. Keep an eye on all of our social feeds. Hayden's on Instagram. We've got the Twitter feeds. We've got institutional ones. When we do get back to Hengistbury, we will put out lots of adverts via Hengistbury Head for what we're up to. So it'd be lovely to see you all in person and do this face to face. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you and sharing this with you all. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll stick the video on YouTube in case you want to show it to your friends later.
Brilliant. Right then. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.